What's going on, everyone? Time to sit back and discuss Star Trek Lower Decks today, because the big question on my mind is, how does Star Trek Lower Decks fit into pre-established Star Trek canon? The short answer, it doesn't. Thanks for coming to my Trek Talk. Live long and prosper, like, share, and subscribe. Oh, sorry, you wanted an actual answer? Alright, well, I actually have one for you. I've mentioned this in a few previous videos. Long story short, it fits into canon by kind of not actually existing. What do I mean by that? Well, the adventures and the crew of the Cerritos, they may be based on real characters, or they may be entirely fictionalized characters. Normally, I would say that they were entirely fictionalized characters created just for the Lower Decks universe. However, it's been confirmed that at least two of the characters, those being Boimler and Mariner, will be appearing in live action on Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And I know what a lot of you are probably saying right now, well, Strange New Worlds isn't part of Star Trek canon anyways. Let's just assume that all of the live action shows currently are, at least in some form, canon. Maybe not in the same universes with each other, but still they are canon. What Lower Decks is to me, and I know this is going to be a little complicated because they don't really have television in the future, but for the sake of easy clarity, I'm going to use TV television show as a placeholder name because I don't want to say Hollow Show or Federation Broadcast or something like that. But to me, Star Trek Lower Decks is a television show created for the Federation, and more importantly, probably created for Starfleet officers as a sort of Starfleet type broadcast. Think of, I know this is thrown around a lot, but think of Rick and Morty type of show being created for a Starfleet audience. And why do I say Starfleet specifically? Well, because a lot of the things referenced in the show potentially wouldn't be common knowledge for normal citizens within the Federation. Possibly they would have been classified, but it is conceivable by the time this show was created and aired, these have become public knowledge and they've been declassified and released to your average citizen. So it doesn't necessarily have to be for Starfleet, but I think that is the best fit. You know, Starfleet officers would be in the know. They would understand how this sort of thing happened. And perhaps this could be a show created by a former Starfleet officer who went through their entire career, and perhaps now they've left the service, they've retired or whatever. And this is kind of their memoirs turned into a fun comedy show. And by that, I think of, picture something like MASH. So there was the MASH movie, there is a MASH TV series, which I think was wildly more popular than the film itself. But both of those were based on an original book, which was based on the events of the author of that book when he was in the military himself. So I'm sure the book itself wasn't entirely accurate. There was probably some names changed, some events that weren't quite 100% the way they occurred. But that book was, all intents and purposes, the real-life recollections of an individual. Then the movie came along, adapted that book, changed some things, changed some characters a little bit, added some characters, changed it into a more comedic thing. Then the show came along and completely changed things from even the movie itself and is a complete departure from the book. So I'm going to say this is a similar circumstance for Lower Decks. It is a former Starfleet officer's recounting, retelling of their adventures and mishaps within Starfleet, and of course then it's being built on. So it's this wild, wacky world that is being built out of a real-life event or a real-life character, just played up to 11 in a zany animated form, because a lot of the cool references to classic Star Trek in this show are very real world to the Star Trek universe. They feel like they belong. They are taking off from events that did occur. They are characters that do exist within the Star Trek universe. However, they don't necessarily act as they normally would. For instance, they do that cutaway joke of Armis. They do some racist stuff with Ferengis. And you have a lot of interaction from former Star Trek people. So you've got, in the most recent episode when I'm recording this, Leah Brahms comes back in a different form, played by the original voice actress. Then you've got Riker, you've got Troy. We saw Tuvok and Morgan Bateson, however, they were not portrayed by any voice actor, so We'll have to see. And then you go back further and you've got a lot of returning guest characters in the first couple of seasons. So you've got a lot of these voice actors from Star Trek and from other properties within the Star Trek universe. So how are these voice actors coming in? Well, in my personal estimation, I think that these are the real world Star Trek characters coming in to guest star on this show in a sort of fun way. So when we see Will Riker fly in to save the day in the Titan, that isn't a real world event that is happening. That is a depiction within the show, and Will Riker, the character within the Next Generation continued universe that we saw in classic Trek, is coming in to voice himself, a stylized version of himself, in Lower Decks. I also had someone comment on one of my older videos that perhaps it's not even Will Riker, it's Thomas Riker, and he's, serving as this voice acting role to sort of pay his debt to society while he's imprisoned for his whole Maquis shenanigans on DS9. That's actually kind of a cool idea also. Then you've got other returning characters. Leah Brahms, obviously, she's well known within Starfleet and within the Federation for her designing of warp cores. You had Tom Paris come in, a hero from the Delta Quadrant. That would be a cool cameo to get on a show. Think of, particularly in the 90s, but I don't know if it happens so much today, where you get that very special episode of a sitcom where, the latest and greatest basketball star stops by, or a random movie star who wouldn't think would be in a TV show just kind of happens to pop in for some reason. I know this isn't the same thing. I'm thinking of like Brad Pitt when he was on Friends because he was dating Jennifer Aniston. They get all these celebrities on the show to kind of boost ratings or kind of throw a bone to the audience, but they're not actually themselves. They're playing their character dialed up to 11 on the show. And I think that is a very fun way to look at this show, because all the inconsistencies don't matter. These could all be based on real world events within the Star Trek universe, because to me, Lower Decks feels the closest to the TNG plus era than any Star Trek that's come out since. Maybe Prodigy has a little of that. Lower Decks far and away feels the most like classic Star Trek TNG plus, except for the fact that it's so zany, over the top. Things are happening in the world that don't make logical sense. There's fun gags that kind of overwrite whole character arcs and undermine things we've seen, and that's because they're not actually happening within the universe. They're exaggerated events that are being adapted, I guess is a good word, for comedic effect. And I just think that by viewing the show through a lens of being a show within a show, or being a show made for those characters, let's say you think of our characters going back to their quarters after a long shift and popping this on and laughing along to a zany crew within Starfleet, kind of mucking about and screwing things up, and seeing these exaggerated versions of characters and events that they know to happen and perhaps even took part in, as a relaxing end of the day sort of situation. So when I look at it through that lens, even when Lower Decks is not firing on all cylinders and I'm finding the episode to fall flat, and I'm like, well, this doesn't really hold up when you look at it through the lens of what actually happened in TNG, Voyager, DS9, it doesn't have to. It's a fun, reference-filled Easter egg-a-thon with lots of fun callbacks and characters and settings and scenarios and ships and all that fun stuff that we remember fondly. But if you look at it like it's not occurring within the universe, it doesn't have that stigma attached to it that kind of takes you out of it. And I know for a hell of a lot of people, that's not a big issue. Canon isn't such a thing that needs to be rigidly upheld. But to me personally, I think it's actually more fun to look at it this way, as opposed to a show actually occurring within the Star Trek universe. So if you think of it, when Boimler and Mariner are going to appear in Star Trek Strange New Worlds physically in their real world actor bodies, so they're not coming in as their animated forms, I'm hoping that they appear in a much less exaggerated, much less zany way, kind of more like a real world person. And if that's the case, then that could lend some credence to the fact that Mariner and Boimler are actual characters within Starfleet that Lower Decks based themselves upon. So whoever is writing Lower Decks, perhaps it's even Boimler. Perhaps after Boimler retires, he's recounting all of these situations, and that's what Lower Decks is based upon. So that would be a cool kind of in-universe way to wrap things up. Until we see that episode where the crossover between Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks occurs, it's kind of hard to say how they're going to do it and how they're going to try and tie it in. So I've also got a theory on how the shenanigans that lead these two crews to meet will happen, but we'll have to see if that happens. I'm going to say it has to do something with a DS9 reference, and just leave it at that for now, because that's going to be a whole separate video. In summary, Star Trek Lower Decks, a television show within the wider Star Trek universe, and that would be a continuation of the universe from TNG up through the end of Nemesis. Enterprise obviously is a prequel, so I'm not going to include that here because that's in the past. So this is a post-Star Trek Nemesis world where this is occurring to, probably 20 or 30 years post that, because like I said, this is a recollection of somebody who has had these events occur, had to have time to write them, had to have time to adapt them into this program. So I think that is where the fun comes in. So until next time, let me know what you think. Do you think Lower Decks is a good show? Do you think it fits into the Star Trek universe at all? Do you not care? Do you like the show? Whatever your thoughts are, leave them below. And until next time, computer and program.